A hazy shade of winter, all the leaves are brown. Good afternoon, my friends. It is I, the lilting voice that is the OGGM, trying to grab in a walk before the sun goes away again. And it already feels like it is. You know, I complain about the weather all the time, but it is my kryptonite. That and popcorn. And speaking of kryptonite, we're talking about superhero role-playing games because I decided I was tired of talking about D&D on these talks. And everything I've said about Dungeons & Dragons can apply to superhero role-playing games. So let's talk about my favorite, Villians and Vigilantes. Why do I love Villians and Vigilantes so much? Because there are better systems. There are systems that I've played. My dyslexic brain often can't wrap its hand around, I don't know what the term is, that would have fit. Sometimes I use words and I don't know what they mean. My dyslexic brain often has troubles with the Villians and Vigilantes math, but still, it's just, there's no tangible reason I can give you why it's my favorite. I think it's a great game. Shadow and Sun has said it's his go-to desert island bug-out game, and that you could run pretty much anything with it. Now, there's a lot of flaws in it, and it's been errated and remade several times. So even Jeff and Jack were never happy with it, considering how many times they've remade it. Plus, there was the whole legal thing with the ownership for so long, but that's not the topic of this video. This video is talking about V&V random powers. I love V&V random powers. I've never rolled random powers making characters or NPC for V&V and not found a way to fit them together. And sometimes the powers can make no connection. Other times it's really easy. The hardest part is always coming up with a name, though, right? If you randomly roll insect powers, Bumblebee, you're like pretty much know your character's going to have some sort of insect-themed name, right? But if you roll a whole bunch of powers that make no sense connection whatsoever, flame powers, and and the ability to turn into a tuna fish sandwich, how do I connect those? So the names are always a problem. Let's face it, 12-year-old me and even 21-year-old me had some really weird named heroes and villains. Now you would think with random powers they don't make sense, and a lot of people who play superhero role-playing games don't like random powers because they like to have the control over building the character they want to play instead of just getting a random number of powers. And sometimes the powers are just dumb, and don't make sense or whatever. But yet V&V always worked. Now there are some problems with the random power table. There's a lot of redundancies between the various random tables that could have been eliminated. I would definitely, almost every time we've run it, we've hacked it to make it make more sense. I usually, always, if I'm running supers, use the descriptions of powers from Heroes Unlimited, as you know, because I say it all the time. Because I think for descriptions of how powers work, those are still some of the best in Heroes Unlimited. So when randomly generating a character, as we went over first time, first you have to figure out how many. Now sometimes it's just pick, the DM will say pick 3 or whatever, Sometimes it was roll 1 randomly and then pick other powers that sort of fit that power. And then sometimes it was just roll randomly. Now, how many powers did you get? You could have anywhere from 1. Oh, you're an owl or something. You could have anywhere from 1 power all the way up to 8 powers, technically. So you determine this by rolling a d6 and adding 2 to your roll. So bare minimum 3, bare maximum 8. But there was also weaknesses in Villians and Vigilantes. And the weaknesses in Villians and Vigilantes, though often as vague as the powers. Hi, how are you today? Hi, doggies, how are you? Were often as vague as the powers, but still, they were pretty debilitating. So the system said if you roll d6 and you add 2 and you end up with 8, well, fine, but if you take those extra bonus 2, that's 2 weaknesses your character had to take. So you could have 8 powers but 2 weaknesses, and those weaknesses could be pretty devastating. Or you could roll d6, add 2, drop 1 for 1 weakness, or roll d6, add 2, roll them all randomly, but then drop 2 if you wanted no weaknesses. So if you rolled a character with no weaknesses, bare minimum 1 power, maximum was 8 powers. Now, as you remember in my story about my character, the assassin, because I was 12 and angry, I rolled the lowest number possible. I rolled 1, and so I decided to take a weakness. But, you know, average character had 3, with or without a weakness. And sure, there were people who just, took abuse the 8 rule, but even then, the characters always worked. You never felt playing V&V that a character with 8 powers was unfair compared to my character with 3. Sure, my character with 2 powers might have been considered a D class or C class hero, but still there was always something to do, and the system worked in such a way that we all felt like we gelled together. We felt like a well-oiled team. It's often been said you could have Superman and Batman in V&V, and they work, and they complement each other, and nobody ever feels left out. So once you've rolled your random powers, you pick which table. And this is the first problem because the tables are a little vague and they're also repetitive. So first table is just raw powers, and that's just pretty much everything you can think of, from A for adaption all the way down to, W for willpower, and plus if you added a few others, but whatever. So that was your wide gamut of all the superpowers. And the tendency was, if you rolled a low number, you probably just wanted to roll on that table because at least you're guaranteed something semi-decent, even if it's ice powers or whatever. The second table was devices. And the devices table looked almost like the powers table, except there was a few in there like robot, body, or vehicle, or special weapon that weren't on the table. But other than that, it was pretty much the exact same table as powers. And there was no way to tell which table. You could roll all on powers, you could mix and match, whatever. Now there were rules, very vague rules, for the device section, for things like charges and what happens if the device gets taken away. But those were all very vague. But basically, you could pretty much roll the exact same character. Again, there were a few things on the powers table that weren't on the device table, and there were a few things on the device table that weren't on the powers tables. The third table was magic psionic device, and this was pretty much an exact duplicate of the technological device table, except it also added in magic psionic spells. And while magic devices were, a pretty common thing, when you have psionic device, we're like, a kyber crystal? What's a psionic device? But still. Then there was skills. Skills was the other table that you wanted to roll on if you didn't have a lot of powers, because again, you were guaranteed to get something cool no matter what, even if it was speed bonus. Okay? Then there was magic psionics, which were like spells and stuff like that. And again, this table looked a lot like some of the other tables, but it was much more cut down. And finally, there were the weaknesses. And the weaknesses was where the game got you. Because, you had your standard, very definitive weaknesses like reduced strength. Then you had more of your open-ended weaknesses like phobia, psychosis, special requirement. Open-ended was a big thing in Villains and Vigilantes. You had a lot of open-ended powers. You had body power, mutant power, special weapon, just to name a few. Vehicle, Plus, instead of giving you a spell system, it just said magic spells, and then you and the DM had to work something out. Instead of listing all the possible psionics, it just said psionics, and you had to come up with something with the DM. Same with the weaknesses. You had the definitive weaknesses like reduced strength, then you had the open-end weaknesses like vulnerability. And that's where the weaknesses could get you. Now, the difference between random powers and random skills was basically what they could do. And a lot of them were the same. Like, I could get heightened strength skill and heightened strength power. What's the difference? Well, the difference was that you rolled random dice. And again, because it's random, that meant that you could roll something very big, but you could also roll something very, very small. So I could roll heightened strength on the power table, which was known as heightened strength B, and then I would add 3d10 to my existing strength. Now, if you remember in my description of the character I made, I only ended up with like a 22 strength because I started as a 12-year-old me with a 10 strength. I rolled 3d10 and it only equaled enough to 12. So from 3 to 30, yeah, it's technically a little bit more, but you also have technically a better chance of just rolling crap, as opposed to the heightened strength skill where you rolled 2d10. So technically your best could be plus 20 as opposed to the power as plus 30. But if I roll, low on this power but high on the skill, I could still end up doing better. So obviously that was one of the many problems people had with V&V, was even the power, the heightened strength stats were random, and I could get overpowered as easily as I could get screwed. Now on the flip side, if you went to reduced strength, that was a dice roll you subtracted from that number, so you could lose way more endurance or agility or intelligence than you could afford. You could have characters running around with really low, like 3 in a strength or whatever, because again, that was subtracting 10-siders. I believe it was 3d10, maybe it was 2d10. I don't remember without looking at the rules, but yeah, I could screw you over. So of course, as the years of playing the game progressed, that was one of the many of the things we've hacked, and that was the many of the things that you saw erratas for and articles on, and whenever the various re-releases of the game, V&V 3rd edition, the weird point-based system, Legendary Lives or Living Legends, whatever it was called, and then of course the current V&V system, they gave you a little bit more leeway with the enhanced stats versus the skilled stats. An exceptionally well-trained acrobat versus somebody whose mutant power is just ridiculous agility. There are limits to what a human can achieve just through training, but there's no limits to what a human could achieve if we're talking about magic or superpowers. So we would be like, all right, if you roll heightened strength B, you automatically start with 10 plus 3d, you raise your stat to X and then add 3d10, as opposed to A, where it would just be add the 2d10 or stuff like that. And every power was based upon a stat and a level. So as you leveled up, your powers got significantly better. But again, because it was based upon a stat, a first level character with a crappy stat could have a really crappy power. I mean, not like, feeble or shift Z powers in Phase Rip Marvel, but still, you've got a strength of 8 and your first level and your power is based upon 8. You're doing range is 8 because it's, you know, stat times level. Well, 8 times 1 is 8. Right, my range for my power is 8 feet. What if your power is like telekinesis or force field or gravity control, where, you know, you need to know a certain amount of mass, and then there's the formula again. The amount of weight I can lift is 8 times my level times, great, I can lift 8 pounds. I can throw a shoe at him. A toddler, 8 pounds. I'm doing a D4. So while the random powers were fun, there were a lot of flaws in it, obviously. And those flaws were often addressed by homebrewing. Every game of V&V I've ever run or played, there was homebrewing. Because it didn't take into account things like mutant races or alien races or whatever, and it didn't take into account other things, you know. So you could have people who randomly generated powers who were significantly weaker than, say, somebody who'd randomly generated skills, or even a general mook. There was that randomness, which was the greatest strength, but also the greatest weakness of Villians and Vigilantes, which is why the randomness was often, if not always, the section that was most hacked. Plus, there was no rules for skills, you know. Now, obviously, 12-year-old me wouldn't have that many skills. It's not like, you know, unless I had some superpower that gave me extra skills or whatever. But other than that, you know, if you're playing yourself and you're playing 12-year-old self, well, I know what I know. If you're playing a character that isn't you, then they had a very vague table for profession and on there, and you could just sort of guess, you know, what skills you had and just sort of make stuff up. But there was no, you know, there was no very specific skill system, and often that was another thing people would homebrew, was a skill system for Villians and Vigilantes. And stuff like that. And then there was very weird rules for inventing and training and experience, because it was a level-based system, and how the powers worked, which a lot of people, most of us loved, though there were occasions where the random, how the powers work also just felt like it didn't make sense. Like, my favorite example is a player character android versus an NPC with mind control, and the NPC mind controls them, and the player character argued, I'm a robot, I don't have a brain. How can you mind control me? And the GM just said, well, because of the way the powers works and the tables work, he was successful, so you're mind controlled. And unfortunately, the description of mind control, like many of the other powers, is kind of vague, kind of up to interpretation. We're talking 1980s. We're talking a game that's like 34 pages, not counting art and tables and the sample adventure. So yeah, sure, you'd be like, well, if your power is built around controlling the minds of humans, this character is a robot and doesn't have a mind, then that should be an automatic defense, right? But it wasn't. The system was just, you know, you had a lower chance to affecting them, but you could still affect them. And the player argued that, you know, but whatever. That was just part of the combat system, which we're not talking about. We're talking about random powers right now. So yeah. And like I said at the beginning, a lot of these were hacked, you know, especially if you're rolling NPCs really quick. You know, we would just be like, I don't know what table I'm rolling on. I'm just gonna, there's 4 tables, so I'll roll 1 through 4, right, or whatever. Then you figure out how many, then you roll your first power, and then you just keep rolling, and then you decide which ones you want to keep, which ones you want to dump. Is a DM gonna let you re-roll? Stuff like that. But still, despite what sounds like a disadvantage, it worked. It worked. Every V&V game worked. Every V&V character worked. Every V&V villain, no matter how ridiculous, tended to work. there were plenty of times when my character felt totally outclassed, even though, you know, later characters of mine were pretty powerful. You know, for every time I just bashed my way through a situation, there were plenty of times when I had to really think. So that was the beauty of V&V. That's why V&V works. And that's today's talk. If you want to hear me more about V&V, let me know. If you never want to hear me talk about Villains and Vigilantes ever again, let me know. Till next time, see ya.